On a chilly Halloween night, 13-year-old Lily, dressed as a Disney princess, decided to go trick-or-treating alone in her quiet neighborhood. The shimmering fabric of her costume caught the moonlight as she wandered from house to house, her bag gradually filling with sweets. The streets were alive with laughter and distant music, but as the night wore on, the joyous sounds began to fade. Turning down a dimly lit street, she noticed an old, rusty van parked at the curb. The driver, a disheveled older man, waved at her, his smile unsettling. "Hey there, little princess. I've got a ton of candy in here," he called, gesturing toward the van's open door. Lily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to run, but curiosity got the better of her. "Really? What kind?" she asked, inching closer, her heart racing. "Oh, all kinds. The best stuff you'll ever taste. Come take a look." His voice was smooth but had an eerie edge. Shadows danced in the back of the van, but it felt wrong. Just then, a distant group of kids burst into laughter nearby, breaking the spell. Lily felt a rush of clarity. "I should get going," she said, stepping back. The man's smile faded, and his demeanor shifted. "Come on, just a quick peek. I promise you won't regret it." His tone turned sharp and he stepped closer, blocking her path. Panic surged through her. As she turned to run, he lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with a grip like iron. "Don't be scared, princess. It'll be fun," Lily screamed, fighting against him, but he pulled her into the van and drove off. When she realized they were headed toward an old, abandoned house, her heart raced with dread. Inside the house, the man shoved her into a dimly lit room, its walls covered in peeling paint. "Just a little surprise, princess," he said, his eyes glinting with malice. She backed away, panic setting in as he approached, but she knew she had to stay strong. Back home, Lily's parents were frantic. It was 11 p.m. and she hadn't returned. Her dad paced the living room, worry etched across his face. Suddenly, he remembered the tracker on her phone. With a quick tap, he discovered she was 30 minutes away. Without hesitation, he jumped into his car and sped off. Adrenaline surged as he drove, determination fueling him. When he reached the old abandoned house where the tracker indicated, he saw the van parked outside. Bursting out of his car, he rushed toward the house, heart pounding. Inside, he heard muffled sounds, a mix of struggle and fear. "Lily!" he shouted, racing through the door. Just as he entered the room, he saw the man advancing on Lily, who stood bravely against the wall. "Get away from her!" her father shouted, lunging at the man. A fierce struggle ensued, and Lily watched in a mix of fear and relief as her father fought to free her. Before the man could react, the police arrived, lights flashing and sirens wailing. They quickly apprehended him, pulling him away from Lily and her dad. As they drove home, shaken but safe, Lily realized how close she had come to losing everything. That Halloween night would haunt her forever, a dark reminder of the danger lurking just beneath the surface. She vowed never to go trick-or-treating alone again, knowing that the warmth of her princess costume could never shield her from the true horrors of the world. In a small, quiet town, a young woman named Sarah was known for her kindness and warmth. One evening, after a late shift at the diner, she began her walk home, the streets deserted and dimly lit. As she turned down a side alley, she noticed a van parked with its door slightly ajar. Curiosity piqued, she approached, but the moment she stepped closer, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was quick. A hand clamped over her mouth, dragging her into the van before she could scream. The door slammed shut, and darkness enveloped her. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of fear and desperation. Sarah's heart raced as she fought against her captor. He was a stranger, cloaked in a mask, his eyes cold and devoid of empathy. He didn't speak, only gestured for her to sit still. Hours passed, or maybe days, time lost meaning. Sarah learned to tune out the sounds of the world outside, but she couldn't ignore the dread that hung in the air. Her captor would return periodically, sometimes with food, but mostly to taunt her. He'd whisper horrific stories of past victims, each more chilling than the last. One night, the van came to a halt. The captor yanked the door open, his figure backlit by the moon. He dragged her out, and they stood before an old, decrepit house hidden in the woods. He shoved her inside, locking the door behind them. Inside, the walls were lined with remnants of his past victims, photographs, trinkets, and notes. Sarah felt her stomach drop. This man had made a twisted collection of lives. Determined not to become another victim, she devised a plan. While he slept, she carefully searched the room and discovered a small, rusted window. She worked tirelessly, prying it open just enough to squeeze through. Under the cover of night, she crawled out and ran into the woods, her heart pounding with adrenaline. But freedom was short-lived. She could hear him shouting her name, the sound growing closer. In a desperate attempt to escape, she stumbled through the trees until she reached a road. A car approached, and she waved her arms frantically. The vehicle stopped, but as she rushed toward it, she saw her captor emerging from the shadows behind her, a sinister grin spreading across his face. The driver's face morphed from concern to horror as the truth dawned. "Get in!" she yelled, but it was too late. The captor lunged, grabbing her just as she reached the door. The last thing Sarah remembered was the car speeding away, leaving her in the dark, the echoes of her screams swallowed by the night. The van had disappeared into the trees, and in the silence that followed, she understood that some monsters never let go. Sarah found herself back in the cold grip of the van, her heart sinking with despair. The driver had fled, leaving her vulnerable. Her captor, the man who had haunted her thoughts since that first night, leaned close, a twisted smile illuminating his features. "You thought you could escape," he taunted. "You're mine, Sarah." "Always have been." As days turned into a blur of fear, she learned more about him. He was no stranger. He had watched her for months before snatching her. He knew her routines, her friends, even her favorite coffee order. Each taunt felt like a dagger, deepening her sense of isolation. But Sarah refused to be broken. She started to collect information about him, his habits, the timing of his visits. Each day he grew more comfortable, believing he had complete control. She seized every moment to mentally map out her escape. One evening, while he was distracted, she noticed a gap in the van's floor where a tool had fallen. With a surge of hope, she pried it loose, concealing it beneath her shirt. That night, she quietly worked on the lock of the van door while he slept. When she finally managed to unlock it, a rush of adrenaline surged through her. The van was parked in the woods again, surrounded by trees. She knew this was her chance. As she opened the door, a sharp twig snapped underfoot, and he stirred. "Where do you think you're going?" he growled, eyes narrowing in fury. Without looking back, Sarah bolted into the dark forest. She ran with every ounce of strength, branches scratching her arms and legs as she pushed through the underbrush. She could hear his footsteps behind her, relentless and angry. Finally, she stumbled into a clearing and spotted headlights in the distance. A road! She raced toward it, desperation fueling her speed. Just as she reached the edge, she heard him calling out to her, his voice echoing in the stillness. A car approached, and she flagged it down. The driver, an older man, stopped and quickly realized the situation. "Get in," he shouted. As she dove into the car, she felt a surge of hope, but she glanced back just in time to see her captor breaking through the trees, a wild look in his eyes. The driver hit the gas, and they sped away. In the safety of the car, Sarah felt a wave of relief wash over her, but the fear lingered. Her captor was still out there, a shadow in her life that wouldn't disappear easily. After the police were notified and a search ensued, Sarah learned to navigate her new reality. She changed her routine, installed security systems, and surrounded herself with friends. But every rustle in the night reminded her of his presence. Weeks later, she received an anonymous message. "You can't hide from me. I'm always watching." It wasn't over. Her stalker was still out there, and as she looked out the window, scanning the shadows, she realized that her life had irrevocably changed. The nightmare hadn't ended, it had merely transformed. And as she fortified her home, preparing for the inevitable confrontation, she vowed that if he came for her again, she would be ready. Days turned into weeks, and the unease in Sarah's life became her new normal. Each night she fortified her home, installing locks and cameras, turning every corner into a fortress. But despite her precautions, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. One evening, as she sat on her couch, scrolling through social media, a notification popped up. A photo tagged with her name. It was a blurry image of her taken from a distance, outside her apartment. Panic gripped her as the familiar message reappeared. "You can't hide from me, I'm always watching." Heart pounding, she called the police again, but they assured her they were doing everything they could. The feeling of helplessness gnawed at her. She decided it was time to take matters into her own hands. With a renewed sense of determination, Sarah enlisted the help of her closest friends. They formed a plan. They would set a trap. Knowing her stalker thrived on his games, she would bait him by creating a false sense of vulnerability. Over the next few days, she pretended to go about her life as if she were unbothered, even posting updates about being out late and visiting places she rarely frequented. All the while, she and her friends set up cameras and surveillance around her apartment, ready for any sign of him. On a night she had strategically chosen, she left her apartment door slightly ajar, leaving her phone on a nearby table to record. She sat silently in a corner, her heart racing, her friends hidden throughout the building, ready to act. Hours passed, and just when doubt began to creep in, she heard it, the sound of footsteps approaching her door. Her heart raced as she watched the silhouette of a man creeping into her apartment, his eyes scanning the room. In that moment, everything shifted. Sarah and her friends sprang into action. They rushed from their hiding spots, surrounding him. The stalker's eyes widened in disbelief as he found himself cornered, the tables turned. "Who do you think you are?" Sarah shouted, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "You've terrorized me for too long." His bravado melted away as he realized he was outnumbered. The police had been notified, and within minutes they arrived to apprehend him. Sarah watched as he was cuffed, his mask of control shattered, revealing the frightened man beneath. As he was led away, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of relief wash over her. The nightmare that had invaded her life was finally coming to an end. The police assured her that he would face serious charges, and with evidence gathered from the cameras, they would build a strong case against him. In the weeks that followed, Sarah focused on healing. She attended therapy, surrounded herself with supportive friends, and slowly reclaimed her life. She took self-defense classes and became an advocate for others facing similar situations, sharing her story and empowering those who felt trapped. Though the scars of the ordeal remained, Sarah learned to transform her fear into strength. She understood that the darkness would never fully disappear, but she could face it, fortified by her own resilience. As she stood in her living room one evening, looking out at the stars, she felt a profound sense of hope. The past had shaped her, but it would not define her future. She was a survivor, ready to embrace whatever came next, determined to live her life on her own terms. When I was 14, I was walking around the mall where my parents worked before it opened, and I was headed to my favorite store so I could be there as soon as they raised the gate. The store was in a relatively quiet part of the mall and right next to a rarely used stairwell, but I always went that way because it was the shortest path between my parents' store and this one. On my way down the stairs, I saw a guy standing in the corner on the bottom level next to an employees-only corridor that led to the rear entrances to stores and eventually outside. I paid him no mind, but as soon as I got to the bottom of the stairs, he was suddenly right next to me. He touched my arm and said, "I don't mean to seem weird, but you're absolutely gorgeous." I said a polite thank you and started to walk away. I guess he wasn't finished with the conversation because he grabbed my arm, stopped me in my tracks, and asked my age. I was really uncomfortable, but decided to be polite in hopes that he'd go away eventually. I told him I was 14, and he said, "No way." I would have guessed 18 feet. I felt relieved when he said that because I naively thought he would become disinterested now that he knew my real age. Wrong again. He proceeded to tell me that he had a small kiosk selling purses and asked if I wanted to follow him to the back corridor to see his backstock. I said, "No, thank you, I'm just headed to browse some clothes." As I turned to go, he grabbed my arm again, this time violently, and began dragging me toward the corridor. I screamed, but since this was a sparsely populated corner of the mall, it took people a few seconds to realize where the scream was coming from and what was happening. He put his hand over my mouth to shush me, and I instinctively dropped to the floor and became a dead weight. This got his hand off of my mouth long enough for me to scream bloody murder, and for a couple of mall employees to run out and see him dragging me. When he saw them, he let go and ran off into the corridor. The police came, statements were taken, security footage was combed, etc. They never found him. He was not an employee and did not own a kiosk, but he had been seen on security footage for a month or so prior, presumably casing the mall. I was very lucky to get away. To this day, I deal with PTSD, and I can't walk anywhere alone, not even to my car in my driveway. That was 15 years ago, and it messed me up big time.